Guhyapati's been a member of the Triratna order for over 20 years, and in 2008 founded the Eco-Dharma Centre in the Catalan Pyrenees. And Eco-Dharma offers loads of courses and retreats and events, bringing together Buddhism, nature connection, spiritual ecology work, lots of kind of cutting edge practices for development of human potential. And in recent years, a new centre has also been established, Ulex, nearby, which runs courses for activists and groups engaged in social change or social justice work. And it's a place that really, I think, has had a huge influence on social change work across Europe, and certainly in the UK. It's given so much inspiration and knowledge and skill to loads of individuals and groups, and really changed the lives of a lot of people who I've met. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Guhyapati, and I'm going to hand over to him now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, nice to be here with you all, to hang out a bit. So, yeah, I mean, what a grand title, I guess. Identity, Insight, and the Socio-ecological Transition. I mean, I find the idea of exploring this stuff quite exciting, really. I think it's really important stuff to explore as well. I think it's one of the places where sort of a deeper kind of exploration or understandings of the Dharma can really support and empower socially engaged work. But it's an absolutely enormous kind of topic. And I think originally when Guyhapati got in touch with me, can you do something online? We're going online now. I think it said something like, 20 minutes, half an hour max, kind of speaking, that kind of thing. So being such a big topic, squeezing it into such a small space, well, we'll see how we go. I'm going to use a mind map. There's like a presentation type program, so we can sort of walk around this mind map a little bit. And yeah, let's see how we get on. I'll dive in, right, and see what happens. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So I think you should now be seeing the screen. And let's see. Okay, so I'm going to pull out. You get to see the mind map in a bit more. A little bit more here, like this first. So yeah, I'm gonna, well, identity and insight, socio-ecological transition. I'm going to look at what do we mean by the sort of socio-ecological transformation, not transition, sorry, and then from there sort of come round to questions about identity, political identity, formation of identity in politics, why it's important in social change, and that will kind of like, that will carries into a little bit of exploration of some of the kind of disputes and challenges there are at the moment around sort of themes to do with identity politics, and then from there we'll come up to kind of explore, so how can Buddhist sort of dharmic kind of approaches and perspectives and insight support us to explore the way that identity can sort of function in political work and social transformation. So let's dive into this. Like, this is the question of social ecological transformation. I mean, things are changing and fast, whether we like it or not, right? So, there's obviously an enormous amount of social and ecological transformation going on at the moment. Actually, we in the work I do, we think of this as a really particular historical moment where the sort of the power structures, the kind of political dispensation of the last 40 years, what we might call neoliberalism, is kind of has come to a point of crisis. And we talk about this as the twilight of neoliberalism. So the twilight of neoliberalism has within it, a bunch of factors. I mean, obviously, there's the big kind of ecological kind of fact of, a growth-based economy kind of on a collision course, or having crashed into non-negotiable ecological limits is a serious crisis. But as well as that, we've got the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crash, i.e. the economic stagnation of the system. We've got a kind of a sense of increasing distrust in political elites to be able to address the challenges that have arisen because of that economic stagnation, a growing sense of distributive injustice, etc., etc. Right? So a kind of a serious crisis in which the power structures of the last few decades is suddenly really under contest. And it's I've got this quote here from Gramsci, because that the moment we're in, I think, resembles something of the time that he was writing, which is the 1930s in Italy during the rise of fascism. And I think the fact that this phrase of his from that point resonates so fully now is suggestive of just how much is at stake. So his quote simply says, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born." So the crisis, and yet what's going to come next, what will grow out of this sort of point of dissolution, we don't know, and that's very much up to be contested. And we can see how strongly that's being contested at the moment in the rise of nationalist populism and a lot of other kind of more kind of right-wing authoritarian type political formations. In this context, in the work I do, we really value the role of social movements. You know, this kind of the importance of building collective agency in order to influence the way that this contest goes. When we think about social movements, we run trainings and so on. As Kate was saying, you know, we're trying to help movements to build capacity to be more effective, more impactful. And we think about 5 different capabilities. And I'm going to focus on one through most of this talk. Mostly we're going to be looking at this first one, the capability related to narrative. You know, movements have a narrative capability. They need to be able to tell a story about, you know, how did we get here? Where do we want to go? And really importantly for movements, there's a big question about, and who are we? You know, who's the we? You know, that kind of constitute this movement. You know, that come together in varying degrees of solidarity to generate a kind of sense of collective agency. Who's the we? And that's what we're going to look at a lot in terms of these questions of identity. But before doing that, just to quickly kind of, you know, sketch through these other 5 capacities for movements, these capabilities that we think about. We also talk about the disruptive capability, you know, the ability to, in a way, sort of disrupt the flow of the day-to-day, the normal functioning of the system that we're seeking to change. So, you know, sort of things like classic sort of tactics, strike actions, boycotts, occupations, vast range of different kinds of like civil disobedience, right? So disruptive capability is very important. Both the narrative and the disruptive, without the third, the institutional capability, they don't really go anywhere. You know, there have to be channels and relays and mechanisms that translate the demands of our narratives and the opportunity of disruption into institutional change. You know, transforming power relations, shifting structures, legislation, policy. You know, this can be reformist or radical kind of institutional transformation, but it has to be that capacity. Fourthly, we talk about a lot about the prefigurative. You know, it's really important in our work to see how do we, in the way that we struggle for social change, how do we embody our values? How can we model the kinds of new social relations that we're, you know, struggling for, that we're trying to bring into being? How can we walk the talk? And fifthly, we do a lot of work around the capacity for of resilience in our movements. You know, it's a long struggle. Often it's intergenerational. It's almost always intergenerational. we're taking on a lot. You know, it can be incredibly overwhelming. It can be exhausting and depleting, and people get burnt out. So there's all of that we have to sort of work with. How do we develop more regenerative cultures in the way that we organise in our movements? But as well as that, there's also the simple fact that generally, if we're looking to achieve social change, normally there is resistance to that change from different directions. There are sort of competing kind of interests and so on. And quite often what we find as our movements get stronger, they become subjected to stronger pushback, kind of forms of repression from the state and non-state actors. So how do we weather that kind of repression and sort of suppressive kind of attacks on our movements as well? So we look at all 5 of these. They're all really important. You know, it's like we can't really have effective, sustainable, impactful social movements without attending to all of these capabilities. But today I'm going to really concentrate on this question of sort of the narrative aspect of our movement building. So, I mean, narrative is like, you know, it's definitely not the case that, you know, we can change the world by changing the story. I mean, that's an incredibly sort of superficial way of thinking about it, but there's something very sort of powerful in that idea as well. I use a lot, we use in our trainings this idea or this tool for systemic thinking called the sort of systems iceberg. I think it's useful in kind of thinking about deep change or deep transformation. You know, this point, this historical point that we're at, you know, the depth of transformation that we require to address just some of the problems we're facing is pretty profound, right? So we have to think about really deep change. How do we understand deep change in a systemic way? Well, the iceberg, you know, points out that, well, what's visible to us most of the time are the events. You know, what's happening right now, the kind of, you know, what's kind of visible day to day. And actually so much activism, so much movement attention can find itself drawn to the kind of firefighting, the kind of responding to immediate needs. Sometimes our response to events can be a bit sort of knee-jerk as well. And I think deep change, you know, we need to learn as well. Of course, we have to be responding to the immediate events in a way, but we also have to create space to reflect and to learn and to analyze more deeply kind of what sits behind those to really understand the conditions that give rise to the events. So we need to learn to look beneath the surface and to recognize the kind of the patterns and the trends that, you know, the ongoing sort of cycles of events kind of help us to notice and identify. And beneath those as well, beneath those patterns and those trends, often we'll find that there are deeper kind of structures, societal structures, power relations, social relations that give rise to the trends, that give rise to the events. And in this system, then beneath the underlying structures, you know, the kind of the underlying structures, things like, you know, legal structures, structures of ownership, means of production, all that kind of stuff, right? Beneath that, we have the mental models. You know, what are the world views, the kind of values, the ideology in a conscious sense, culture in an unconscious sense of the things that sort of underpin the structures and then the patterns. So I think when we're thinking about narratives, we are talking about interventions that start to shift the mental models. They shift the way we think. By telling particular kinds of stories, we change the way we think, we change mindsets, we empower different kind of sets of values. We articulate sort of a sense of our potential as human beings, as a society, and so on. You know, in this case, for me, very much is about, you know, shifting away from mental models that sort of emphasize kind of in the sort of the individual and a sort of competitive type mindset to one that's much more about cooperation and sort of solidarity. But this model is a little bit, I mean, I find it a little bit problematic, because it kind of does suggest that we can just go and work at this level of transforming ways of seeing, and therefore kind of underlying structures will be, you know, reconditioned and change on the basis of that. But actually, I think that's a bit of a simplistic way of seeing it. And I think, you know, as Dharma practitioners, will recognise this sort of the problems with thinking that there's a single primary cause and everything else sort of builds on top of that. Actually, you know, there's a mutually dependent relationship between the societal structures, economic and social structures, and the mental models. They kind of mutually reinforce each other. And so you can actually engage in interventions at both levels, at either level, and they will begin to have an effect on each other. So it's not that we would prioritize in kind of social transformation work the mental models as such. We can work at either of those levels, but both are very, very important. So we need to be kind of both kind of engaging, if we go back to this idea of movement capabilities, building our narrative capacity. You know, how do we communicate values, build culture, etc., etc. But also, you know, how do we shift the structures that are both expressions of those mindsets, but also condition those mindsets. So yeah, I'm not going to dwell too much longer on that. It's obviously something we could spend a lot of time talking about. But anyway, it sort of takes us into this question about the role of identity. You know, narratives, as I said, part of this question of sort of narrative capacity is telling the story of like an identity, getting a sense of who are we, right? Who are we in our sort of political work? So formation of political identity, really such a central aspect of movement building. So we talk about political identity as something that can be empowering, which is obviously what we aim for, but can become limiting in certain ways. But it can also be not only empowering, but actually liberating. So what does that all mean? That's kind of what I want to be exploring over the next little while. So how's political identity empowering? Well, the process of developing movements and shifting consciousness in order to build kind of collective agency, sometimes is thought of as a sort of process of politicization. Yeah. So politicization is the recognition that many of the kind of experiences we have on a day-to-day level, the discontents, the problems we experience often are shared, and we have those in common with others, and that many of the causes or the conditions for those sort of those problems are to do with social and political structures, right? So this is recognition through politicization of a sort of commonality of our grievances, and a recognition of the way that those grievances are perpetuated, as it were, through different kinds of injustice and oppression. So politicization is that recognizing how, you know, the problems at a personal level very often have these kind of political are based in sort of, you know, political in the political sphere. And so there's this process of articulation where we articulate a sense of that commonality, you know, the we, right, who are faced by these challenges, by these problems, and a sense sometimes of what it might look, what it could look like, how that could be different. And through that, you know, we're building a sense of solidarity with one another through recognizing that commonality, through building that sense of where we're going. We strengthen a sense of our collective agency. So empowering political identities, they build collective agency, they help us to recognize the commonality of our grievances and potentially vision. They reveal injustice. But also they importantly help us to construct for ourselves positive confident, sort of, empowered sense of self, of who we are. So often our engagement in society is relatively disempowered, because we don't really honor our potential for transformation. We don't really have confidence in the sense that we together can build something different. So the construction of political identity is very much related to this building of a sense of confidence and potential, and honoring both our personal and also social potential is very important. So yeah, political identity, in the sense, the empowering political identities are vital. However, when we create a political identity in this way, we recognize our commonality. We can create the sense of we, right, the us. But as we all know, if we're paying attention, then the us requires a them, right? There's a who we're not. It's just a fundamental part of the formation of identity. There's no identity without a boundary around it, right? There's no position without a here and a there, right? And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with that. That is just the nature of kind of engaging in conditioned reality. It's a sort of inevitable function of like language, But there are ways in which this sense of difference can become, recognizing difference in itself is fine, yeah. But there's a way in which this recognizing difference is becoming entrenched in a way that polarizes and limits us. It becomes something that kind of imprisons and ensnares and entraps us, and no longer empowers us in a political sense. So through a kind of a very strong kind of othering type process, we can find ourselves becoming very isolated as political agents, as political groups. We can find it very increasingly difficult to find points of connection and potential for building coalition, or a larger sense of solidarity, and a larger we. We lose the capacity for building allyship. And we can get very entrenched in this kind of othering tendency, so that not only does that start to sometimes create a lot of fragmentation within our movements, but because we reproduce this kind of polarizing tendency, this sort of limiting mode of identification, we reproduce it within our groups. Our groups begin to fall apart more. It's like we atomize and break down. Cooperation becomes more and more difficult. Antagonism becomes very much the kind of norm. Conflict becomes very much the norm. So yeah, this kind of makes it very difficult for us to kind of stay open, to learn, our views narrow down, our hearts also narrow down, and so on, right? So I'm sure you've all can all have a sense of what that can feel like in our own lives, and perhaps politically as well, from our own experiences. So empowering identities, limiting identities, these overlap in different ways. Often we kind of we're kind of moving between one or the other. But also, in our work, we and this is a sort of a Dharma kind of influence, I think, we try to bring in this idea of, what would a liberating identity look like? And we're kind of saying, well, a liberating identity, a political identity, is going to be one that is conscious of the sort of non-essential nature of identity. It recognizes that our identities are conditioned, that they rise in dependence upon conditions. Doesn't mean they can be entirely chosen, but they are conditioned. And that our positions are inevitably partial and provisional. So, a liberating sense of political identity would be one where we understand the way that identity can be formed in a way that's empowering. We recognize the dangers in the limiting kind of tendencies within that, and we're helped to stay more creative and more responsive in the way that we articulate our identity, because we recognize the non-essential nature of identity, and we're more open to the partial and provisional and conditioned nature of our positions politically, our political identities, our group affinities, etc., etc. We'll come back to that in a little while. Okay, so I hope you're still with me to some extent. Yeah, so you can kind of see here how in this, just before moving on, how in thinking about identity here, there's sort of scope to move into a more sort of dharmic kind of framing and explore how the Dharma can help us to keep our identities both empowering and liberating and less limiting. So let's move on here. Okay, so we're going to explore a little bit coming out of this, some of the dynamics in the sort of area of what is these days commonly sort of spoken of as identity politics. I'd love to get into thinking about the kind of history, the process of shifts away from class-based politics to the new social movements to identity-based politics and all the rest of it. But honestly, there's obviously not time to get into the historical trajectory of all of that. But let's sort of dive into this, because I think when we look at some of the disputes around identity politics, we can sort of see some of the challenges of negotiating this sort of range of forms of political identity formation, empowering, the limiting or imprisoning, and the liberating. So yeah, so disputes, well, I mean, raging all over the place these days. I mean, in the sort of, on the political left and in the sort of liberal kind of progressive kind of sphere, in the United States, especially. Identity politics is seen as a kind of is often regarded as a kind of pseudo politics. There's a lot of criticism of identity politics, or politics which is geared towards sort of fighting for the rights, the inclusion, the recognition of particular groups, as actually very divisive and not able to build a sufficiently broad base to achieve real political power. So this kind of critique gained a lot of traction after the election of Donald Trump, and a number of kind of liberal progressive kind of commentators started saying, look, this emphasis on different groups, different identity groups, LGBTQI, people of color, disability groups, etc., etc., etc. This isn't helping us to build a sense of, the mass mobilization and solidarity of citizens, and this is kind of losing us the political power, and it's also feeding into the kind of identitarian politics that the populist right are really leveraging. So there are writers like this guy Mark. Oh, sorry. There we go. Maybe. Let's see. Yeah, Mark Leela. I don't know if I can zoom in on this anymore without. Yeah, maybe. Let's see. Yeah, Mark Leela. I mean, he wrote this book, The Once and Future Liberal, and there's a couple of quotes there. I mean, basically, he saw the kind of he considered the sort of the shift to identity politics as something that very much was kind of an expression of individualism, an expression of the influence of sort of the neoliberal individualistic type culture, a move away from a sense of the bigger sense of politics as a kind of as a sort of civic duty, but much more about kind of a self-interested fighting for my rights and an expression of narcissistic identity formations, in a way slightly symptomatic of atomization, right? And because of that, this sense that the liberal progressive, the Democratic Party in this case, really kind of had lost connection with much of its base. Right? So that was, this is the kind of argument that he was making. Interesting though to just bear in mind that clearly Mark Leela and a lot of the commentators who make these sorts of comments, most of them are white male academics. Most of them are themselves in positions of relative sort of privilege. And so perhaps it's difficult to understand why other groups might want to prioritize challenging the sort of the day-to-day oppressions they experience in their lives, as members of different kind of groups. So there's that kind of critique from the left and the sort of, progressive liberals, but also there's a sort of a problem that we see a lot at the moment, which is that identity politics, as they've become more and more prevalent in the left and sort of progressive groups, actually they've also become much more a central part of the way that the new right, the kind of alt-right, are organising. So there's this quote from Steve Bannon, who I'm sure you'll have come across Steve Bannon. The longer they talk about identity politics, I've got them. It's like from the point of view of nationalist, populists, authoritarian, alt-right kind of organisers, their sense is that the engagement with identity politics on the left or the amongst liberal progressives serves the right, is actually serving the nationalist, populist, identitarian kind of tendencies. It's like they're more able to leverage kind of narratives around traditional Christian, white, traditional culture and the way that that's being attacked by these kind of minority groups or whatever, right? So sort of white supremacist kind of narratives have actually gained much more prominence in recent years. And we just look at just now the last weekend, or this week there was the final runoff in the presidential elections in Poland. And Duda, who won that, ran much of that campaign based on a sort of a stigmatization, demonization of LGBTQI people and community. Similarly, in Hungary, you've got like Viktor Orban has sort of started experimenting with that as well. For a long time, it's sort of immigrants and George Soros were the kind of the demons for Orban. And as those kind of narratives kind of became a bit tired, he also shifted to attack LGBTQI kind of groups. And partly it's like the identity politics that makes those groups more visible kind of creates the target, and the way that they challenge the kind of the cultural assumptions and privileges of the status quo creates certain kinds of opportunities that are leveraged by the right. So we've got all of that going on. Let's see. However, what's really meant by it, right? So identity politics. The idea isn't, the idea isn't to alienate white working class people, right? It's not meant to alienate kind of the broad kind of mass of some kind of citizenship. It is very much about trying to mobilize against shared injustices and structural inequalities. So the first place, it seems like, if you kind of do a bit of reading around identity politics, often this quote from the Combahee River Collective comes up as the place where the idea of identity politics as a thing kind of first arises. So 1977, and in that Audre Lorde and other activists involved in that group, and they say, we believe that the most profound and potentially the most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. So this is a group of black feminists, and they're kind of saying, look, we as black women suffer particular kinds of oppression, intersection of different kinds of discrimination and prejudice. It gives us a very particular kind of experience of oppression, and it's in addressing that we can most sort of directly work for real emancipation. Right? So, and it's sort of creating this identity, political identity of black women, kind of in order to empower efforts to challenge injustice and challenge and bring attention to particular kinds of structural inequality. So as I said before, it's like, often from a kind of a, white liberal perspective, we sort of say, oh, but, surely they're just kind of creating sort of fragmentation, aren't they? Isn't this sort of ever smaller groupings of, who are the oppressed, just leading to fragmentation? We get that. Well, yeah, no, not really, in a sense. I mean, Mark Leela, the guy I quoted before, I think in the same book that those quotes from, he says something like, Black Lives Matter is a textbook example of how not to build solidarity, right? That's what he says, a textbook example of how not to build solidarity. So, I mean, I don't think anyone's going to dispute that there are some aspects of identity politics that give rise to fragmentation. On the right, they're intended to, in a certain sense, aren't they? But actually, to sort of make that claim about Black Lives Matter as a textbook example of how not to build solidarity, I think it really fails to understand some of the sort of necessary dynamics involved in challenging power for oppressed groups. We could say that actually, right, it's the oppressor, right, who kind of has fabricated and continues to fabricate the oppressed subject, right, that constitutes the oppressed subject, and in trying to empower ourselves against oppression, often what happens is oppressed groups kind of reclaim the signifiers of oppression, right, and re-articulate them against the oppressor. So we say, in the case of the Combahee River Collective, it's like, we are Black women, right? We're not just women, we're not just Black, we're Black women. We kind of take on this particular position. And those in sort of positions of privilege, might say, but you're just polarizing. You're just creating this kind of like polarizing, fragmenting identity. But in fact, articulating that identity is what exposes and makes visible a polarization that is already inherent within the oppressive system. Black women already, right, are experiencing oppression, polarization, fragmentation. The specific experience they have on a day-to-day basis of particular kinds of lived experience of oppression, right, isn't something that's created when they call themselves Black women. It's actually that by naming themselves in that way, it gives attention to an opportunity to organize, to oppose that polarization inherent in the system. So they're not polarizing, they're drawing attention to the fact that actually there's already incredible structural polarization here inherently. So we get a sense of that, right? That the aim of creating this kind of identity is, to empower these groups to expose structural inequality, but not just for Black women as an end in itself. In a way, that's also part of a bigger kind of process. So this next kind of quote at the bottom of the screen here now, I don't know how well you can read that, but in the same document from 1977, a bit later in the document, it says, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. So although there's this kind of this sense of like, let's create this kind of quite an exclusive sense of political identity, Black women, in order to challenge these very particular experiences of oppression on a day-to-day basis in our lives, right? Actually, the project is one of a kind of universal human emancipation. But but there's a recognition that that journey towards overcoming all systems of oppression involves articulation of the particular, differentiated, and specific experience of oppression as it's lived and felt. Struggling for universal emancipation requires us to struggle in a particular, differentiated, specific ways about particular oppressions, about specific power relationships. We can't struggle in a universal way. We have to struggle and fight and challenge in particular ways. So, I mean, so there's this idea of a movement from the kind of particular towards the universal. It's not meant, to be fragmenting. It's meant to be a strategy that helps, us all to become emancipated. And so, there's kind of, somewhat ridiculous kind of responses to Black Lives Matter, of like, all lives matter. It's like, yes, sure, yeah, of course we get that. That's kind of like that's sort of already to be taken for granted, right? So, are there contradictions and are there risks in this kind of in this kind of approach? Well, yes, and there are. I mean, it's like, all social transformation involves contradictions and involves risks. One way of thinking about these contradictions and risks is through the work of Frantz Fanon, who, if you haven't read Fanon's work, I really recommend it. Fanon was born in the mid-1920s in Martinique. He studied and worked in France, went to Algeria, where he also worked for a long time as a psychiatrist there. He was a revolutionary, very involved in and inspiring within the sort of anti-colonial independence movements of that time. And a couple of his key works were a book called Wretched of the Earth and another one called Black Skin, White Masks. So, yeah, I mean, for Fanon, this sort of this contradiction between the sort of the particular and the universal, he says it's a sort of endemic to the transformative process in itself. Any effort to achieve emancipation involves development through contradictions, development from posing particular specific demands and perspectives to be reaching for kind of universal human emancipation. So, yeah, I mean, he struggled very much against racism and colonialism. Those were the kind of specific fears that he was struggling within. But he saw those struggles against racism and colonialism as part of a kind of an emancipatory journey towards a sort of universal human liberation. And he understood that state as a world, he called it a world of reciprocal recognition. So it wasn't some sort of universalized space where difference is gone, but the sort of the identity of the proletariat, the identity of blackness were instrumental and things in a way that would themselves be transcended, right? So yeah, he was a radical psychiatrist. He recognized that the journey that we're talking about, this emancipatory journey, is both a political process and a psychosocial process, right? There's a way in which there's a book by somebody called Peter Hoodis. I think it's on the slide as well here, right? And in it he says, look, Fanon kind of embraces in his struggle what Hoodis calls the mythos of the Black identity. And Fanon says, for the good of the cause, right? So he takes on the mythos of Black identity for the good of the cause. That's to help provide the oppressed subject with the confidence and self-assurance that's needed to take on a racist world. But Fanon, in that, isn't accepting the claim that there is an authentic black essence, or a kind of a at the time there was a big search in for sort of a genuine African culture. He doesn't take that literally, right? He sort of sees these as a myth, as a necessary myth, and he kind of, he takes these identities on in order to, provide the confidence and the self-assurance needed to take on the racist world. So this is the sense when we talk about the idea of empowering identity. It's not an identity in itself. It's a sort of a stage in the struggle, in the political and the psychosocial process towards emancipation. And for Fanon, he embraces these identities because of the instrumental value of them, not because they're end points or absolute truths about who he is. So the risks, well, are there risks in this? And yes, you could say that, as Peter Hoodie says, nothing's easier than to fall into a fixed particular, right? A kind of a limiting identity, as it were, even as one argues against fixation. We as Buddhists, we've got quite a bit to say, right, about the way that psychosocial needs and tendencies can make us all too prone to fall into attachments to essentialist assumptions about our identities, about who we are. So Fanon's got lots to say about this, but I think also it's interesting for us right now to move on a bit to, well, what's the Dharma perhaps got to offer us here? It's like without care, our empowering identities, as Fanon is kind of articulating, they become limiting and imprisoning. So how can the Dharma help us to navigate the kind of treacherous path, as it were, through empowerment to liberation? I hope that makes sense to you. So, okay, so here we go. Let's move up on the mind map to this area around insight and so on. Holding to nothing whatever. Oh, that's tiny, isn't it? Let's see that very well. Make that a bit bigger. Okay, let's try it like that for now. So yeah, again, so I mentioned, diegetic every 20 minutes, half an hour or something. I'm probably over that, aren't I? But mentioned, this idea of a theme, holding to nothing whatever. And yeah, we think about identity, insight. Surely this idea of holding to nothing whatever is an important thing to be bearing in mind. It's like there's the sort of holding to nothing is kind of pointing us towards this idea of like, no self, etc. Right? How does it help us to navigate the risks and the contradictions of political struggles for socio-ecological transformation? Well, I mean, it can be helpful, but I think it's really important to recognize that holding to nothing whatever is not itself, it's not an end in itself. In some ways, holding to nothing whatever isn't really even a place to start from bringing a sort of a dharmic approach to this. If we, for example, if we think that holding to nothing whatever, we could take it as implying that we should be letting go of our positions, of our political positions, of our political identities. But I think that would be a big mistake. I think that would be a real failure to really get a hold of what the Dharma is trying to point at. Is this idea of holding to nothing whatever, is that sort of suggestion, that advice, is it really about letting go of self? Is it really about letting go of positions? And I don't think it is. I think it's about letting go of the ignorant belief that our self is fixed, or that our identity is grounded in something essential. So, holding to nothing, whatever, it's a kind of, it functions to encourage us to let go of the ignorant belief and attachment that our positions are, absolutely true. They're grounded on something, really solid. So, it encourages us to acknowledge that our positions and our identities and our views are inevitably partial and provisional. So holding to nothing doesn't mean that we should not hold to positions or views or identities. It's just that we shouldn't hold on to them as essentially true, or something we can fix, meaning, make solid, fixable. Right? To the extent that our positions and our identities are actually empowering, we should absolutely hold on to them, right? At least until the point where we can exchange them for liberatory identities. Right? Letting go isn't actually going to help us to become emancipated. We're only able to build liberating identities if we first constitute empowering identities. In order to approach liberation, we first need to be able to build real solidarity with each other and with life. Holding to nothing whatever, I think it points to, really importantly, specific moments, certain stages in our spiritual development. But if we try to hold to nothing whatever in the wrong way or at the wrong time, it would disempower us and make it impossible for us to learn how to hold to nothing whatever. I mean, this is the same as, I think this is a fairly common way of thinking about things in Dharma circles these days. The idea that, non-attachment is actually a very advanced teaching, right? And that before we try to practice non-attachment, first of all, we need to learn to form healthy attachments. I think is the same. If we think about this idea of holding to nothing, whatever, before we try to practice holding to nothing, whatever, first of all, we've got to learn to hold things well. So, on the whole, I think more useful the idea of holding to nothing, whatever, is the idea of holding to things lightly. Holding to things, holding to views, holding to identities lightly. I think this is a much more useful recommendation than holding to nothing, which can be quite a negating kind of tendency, sort of an expression of aversion in some ways to life. But even holding lightly it's not something we can just choose to do, right? We can't will ourselves to hold things lightly. As Dharma practitioners, we know that the capacity to hold lightly to views and identities depends on a range of psychosocial conditions, of psychological and social conditions. We know that when we're under attack, if we're subjected to traumatizing oppressions, discriminations, if we are made to feel invisible or somehow we're reduced, not fully seen, all of that causes us to hold more tightly. And we need to create spaces where we feel safer. We need to create spaces where we're not faced with oppression, but we're met with solidarity. We need to create spaces where we are able to be seen and we begin to see each other more fully for who we are, to support us to hold less tightly, to hold more lightly. So, developing the capacity to hold more lightly, it's a transformative process that happens simultaneously within us and around us, which is why, I talk about it in this way, like psychosocial process. Right? And it requires us to recognize the inseparability of transforming ourselves and transforming our social relations and communities. So okay, so I try and sort of round off, right? I'll try and sort of finish off by mentioning the idea that, you know, holding to nothing as well. It's like, this is, you know, it's an important part of the Dharma life, but it's part of the Dharma life. It's the part that emphasizes the wisdom dimension, right? And I gave a talk a couple of years ago called Groundlessness and Solidarity, I think it was. And I mentioned Gajin Nagao's contribution to understanding the relationship of Madhyamaka and Yogacara. And there's a slide, I think, that mentions, yeah, that his idea of the simultaneity of ascent and descent. And he's saying, you know, this holding to nothing, whatever, wisdom teachings, the idea of the sort of emptiness teachings, the deconstructive kind of practices of insight. This is the movement of ascent. But this is only part of what the Dharma is pointing to. The Dharma also points us to a movement of descent, right? The idea of the Buddha qualities manifesting in the world through compassionate action. And he says, you know, these kind of have to be happening, or they do happen simultaneously, not one after the other. So it says, you know, the purpose of holding to nothing whatever as a practice, right? You know, it has a socio-ecological function, right? It's a practice of non-attachment, of non-grasping. You know, they're not to lead to dissociation, but they're intended to help us to free up creative vitality in service of life. Right? And the practices of deconstruction, they're not to kind of negate the world, but to kind of realize and to release the kind of creative potential within this conditioned life, this conditioned world that we sort of live and breathe within. So, you know, if we come back to this sort of idea of identities and sort of empowerment and so on, maybe we can say, well, you know, it's only, I think, through constituting empowering identities in solidarity with each other that we build the capacity to acknowledge groundlessness. And it's through our attempts to inquire into and to rest in groundlessness that our practices of solidarity will be truly liberatory. In that sense, going back to these identities, like, we need empowered identities before we can have liberatory identities. And when we constitute empowering identities, we're always going to run the risk of getting trapped, getting imprisoned in sort of limiting identities. But that is just the risk. That is just the basic contradiction of what it is to commit to being in the world and to finding our way through, you know, the complexity of spiritual change, of socio-ecological transformation. So, I mean, most of you, any of you heard me do little talks before, you'll know that I love this quote, and I'll finish with it because if I can find it, let's see. There we go. Yeah, this is I think really pulls all of that together in a lot of ways. So Guhyapati, the great Guhyapati, when we recognize the empty nature, the energy to benefit others dawns, effortless and uncontrived. And yeah, I just find that the sort of the beauty in that it's the empty nature that's kind of releasing, in a way, this creative, spontaneous, compassionate activity and our capacity for that. And yeah, this sort of notion of sort of the dawning of energy to benefit others, effortless and uncontrived. And yeah, so yeah, just finish off with that and probably stop, because otherwise we'll be way beyond even the kind of the outside times on that. So yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I can turn that into a PDF actually and stick it in the chat if you're interested. Well, even if you're not interested, I'll do it. How about that? And then if you're interested, you can download it. And if you're not interested, you can just ignore it, right? I'll do that now. Yeah. So yeah, cool. I hope that was okay.
Thank you so much, Guyhapati. That was
Yeah.
yeah, that was really great. Thank you. Thanks so much for that. So would you like to take any questions, or should we end it there? And either is fine.
I don't mind. I'm happy to engage with people if that's viable. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got about
Yeah.
10 minutes left, and if anybody wants to ask a question, you could either put it in the chat, or if you go to the participant, if you click on participants, which should be a little icon on the bottom of your screen, and then you go to your own name, there should be a option to press more, and then you can raise your hand. And then so yeah, we've got Paul who has raised their hand, and I'll just ask you to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Gia. As usual, you always leave me just stretching to kind of hold on to what you've been saying, but I thought it was a wonderful presentation. It's not really a question, it's just that as you were talking, I was reminded of a comment the Dalai Lama made a long time ago, and he was asked as if there was one teaching that he felt was more important than anything. It was about the union of the two truths. And when I look at emptiness, of nothing, holding on to nothing whatsoever, I'm reminded of ultimate truth, of emptiness. And then the other truth being the conventional relative truth. And, that what you've just done felt to me very much, about the union of those two. So, the Dilgo Kienzi quote, I think, just actually emphasize that. So for me, that really kind of resonated from, what I've been taught to kind of what you've been saying there. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally, Paul. I think that's right. I mean, there's a whole bunch of quotes, aren't there, from the Mula Madhyamika Karikas that would kind of, also sit very well with this kind of relationship between like empowering and liberating identities, and the idea that it's the recognition of emptiness is what helps us to, in a way, it's emptiness that makes everything possible. It's not a negation of what's here, it's just a negation of the false impression that there's something more substantial, solid and grounded, right? Yeah, so it's really a creative principle in a way. Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Just waiting to see if there are any more hands raised in the chat. Sorry, yeah, anybody raises any other hands. Guhyapati, there's also a few questions and comments in the chat if you wanted to look at that and see if there's anything you want to pull out or respond to. Are you able to have a look at the chat?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, we've got VJ. I'll just ask you to unmute.
You unmute me now.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks so much. So it's really inspiring. So
hello.
I'm interested in the creation of safer spaces. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about maybe how you can go about doing that. Maybe what are the strategies? What are the key? I'm not quite sure. Sorry, I'm overloaded and terribly inspired by what you said, so I'm not very clear. But could you say a bit more about how we can create safe spaces, please, for each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talk about safer spaces, because I think one of the important, a really important kind of principle in trying to hold safer spaces is the acknowledgement that a truly safe space is not something you can ever guarantee. Because all of us coming into different spaces, it's so hard to really be able to completely own all of the kind of conditioning, the kind of cognitive kind of biases and so on and so forth that we carry. And I think often for anybody who kind of on a day-to-day basis is kind of experiencing different kinds of oppressions, microaggression, etc., it's like just the wrong phrasing, it can actually be, it can land in a way that can be really, really painful and really difficult. So I think, acknowledging how hard it is to create those spaces, acknowledging that, however hard we try, there are going to be points at which we kind of get it wrong, and there has to be a willingness to kind of like listen to and be open to the experience of hurt and difficulty, to step outside of our own sense of, you know, I'm okay, kind of, you know, sense of well-being, to see, well, actually this space that I think is safe for this person or this person actually is a very unsafe space, you know, sort of being able to acknowledge and to be open to that. So yeah, not thinking that we can create, you know, guarantee safe spaces, but we can try to make safer spaces. I think being willing to acknowledge that, you know, there are dynamics of power and privilege in most of the sort of social spaces we're in. You know, being willing to really acknowledge that, take that seriously, not to diminish those things, not to make them sort of secondary in our understanding of what's going on in the space. I think there's some good, I mean, a couple of like concrete kind of things to have a look at. There's some really good models around this idea of mainstreams and margins in groups, which I think is really worth a look at. So mainstreams and margins. I mean, if you Google it under Training for Change, or an American collective who do a lot of work on this stuff, Training for Change, mainstreams and margins. And the way that, you know, the way that the different forms of exclusion sort of manifest in groups, particular modes of communicating that sort of, you know, predominate and create mainstreams that are kind of excluding of other ways of being and communicating. I think that's really useful. Yeah. Being prepared to talk about it, you know, being prepared to talk about it. Yeah, acknowledge the fact of, you know, gender, race, and other types of class, etc., etc. These dynamics are present and play out. It's not in our Sangha. Our Sangha sits in a bigger socio-political and ecological context, and is inevitably kind of influenced. There's not a hard boundary, right, around the Sangha space. And all of those kind of bigger structural injustices, they're playing themselves out in our spaces as well, inevitably. So being prepared to be honest about that, acknowledge that, place to start. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Guhyapati. I think we'll bring things to a close now. I just wanted to say thank you again for a really inspiring and thought-provoking talk, and thanks to everybody who's come and your involvement and attendance and questions and comments. Yeah, so I'm going to close this now. If people want to watch it again, it's been live streamed and there will be a video uploaded eventually as well. So thanks everyone. Have a really good rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Good to see you all. Yeah, thanks for hanging out. Bye-bye.
Bye.